Hello. So, welcome everyone to this webinar on measuring women's agency, validated tools from the Magnet Initiative for Integration into Household Surveys. I am Irene Toma, representing the Secretariat of the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys, and I will be moderating today's session. We are delighted to host our colleagues from the Measure for Advancing Gender Equality, the Magnet Initiative, and from the National Statistical Office of Malawi, who will be sharing their work with us today. Before we get started, a few practical notes. So today's webinar is being recorded, and all materials will be made available on our website following the session and on UN Stats YouTube page. We will have an open Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and we will do our best to address them. You can also take the floor and ask questions yourself during the session at the end. So to set the stage, allow me to say a few words about the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. Established in 2015 by the UN Statistical Commission, the working group brings together 11 international agencies and 10 member states, and is currently co-chaired by UNESCO and UNICEF, with its secretariat hosted at the UN Statistics Division. Its core mission is to enhance survey coordination, champion innovative approaches, and advocate for the essential role that household surveys play in producing reliable social and economic data. Since its establishment, the working group has been fostering improvement in the scope and quality of social and economic statistics delivered through household surveys programs at the national, regional, and international levels. It provides a global vision for household survey systems, promotes harmonization of survey methods, and regularly reviews new methodological innovations. So it is in the spirit that we are hosting today's webinar, promoting knowledge exchange by bringing together leading researchers and practitioners to showcase validated field-tested tools that can be integrated into national survey programs worldwide. We are also joined today by Maria Isabel Cobos Hernandez, who leads the program on social and gender statistics at the UN Statistics Division. I will now hand the floor to her to share more about the gender work underway at UNSD. Maria Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irene. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from New York. As Irene mentioned, I am Maria Isabel Cobos, and on behalf of the United Nations Statistics Division, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Measuring Women's Agency, Validated Tools from the Magnet Initiative for Integration into Household Surveys. Distinguished panel, colleagues and partners, as part of my opening remarks, I would like to briefly highlight UNSD's work on gender statistics, including its long-standing role in developing and promoting statistical standards and strengthening country capacities to integrate a gender perspective into official statistics. We are meeting at a pivotal moment, as we just marked the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform Declaration and Platform for Action, and look toward the final stretch of the 2030 agenda. Our collective efforts are focused not only on producing data, but also on ensuring that gender statistics drive meaningful and lasting impact. These efforts build on the transformative decision of the United Nations Statistical Commission to mainstream a gender perspective into all statistical work, recognizing that gender is not a niche topic, but a cross-cutting perspective that enhances the relevance, quality, and coherence of all official statistics. The latest report of the Secretary General on Gender Statistics and the recent 10th Global Forum on Gender Statistics have underscored that while we have made notable progress in data availability, with coverage of gender-specific SDG indicators rising to over 57%, the gains remain fragile. A central challenge remains bridging the gap between the high-level sex-disaggregated data we often produce and the granular, nuanced insight that are required to truly understand women's lives, power, and autonomy. For too long, household surveys have relied on a narrow set of decision-making questions or a single household health respondent, which often masks intra-household dynamics. As outlined in the recently updated Handbook of Surveys on Individual and Households, mainstreaming gender into survey design and implementation means systematically addressing these biases throughout the entire life of the survey. As Secretary of the Interagency and Expert Group on Gender Statistics, UNSD plays a central role in implementing the Global Gender Statistics Program, as mandated by the Commission. In this context, UNSD has been instrumental in raising awareness on the value of gender statistics, supporting their use and evidence-based policymaking for the 2030 Agenda, and fostering collaboration across national statistical offices, policymakers, and development partners. Through the Minimum Set of Gender Indicators portal, UNSD has facilitated access to harmonized data and metadata, enabling countries to monitor progress in a consistent international comparable manner. And in parallel, UNSD has also supported national statistical capacity through targeted initiatives, including facilitated peer-to-peer learning and the exchange of good practices in gender statistics across countries and regions. This is why the work of the World Bank Measures for Advancing Gender Equality, or MAGNET, initiative is so critical. Within this ecosystem of international statistical development, MAGNET addresses critical data gaps by developing and validating tools that capture preferences, control over assets, and true sense of agency across both traditional and non-traditional domains. MAGNET builds on the methodological foundations established by the EDGE project, which UNSD implemented in partnership with the World Bank a few years back, including the development of piloting of internationally tested survey modules and methodological guidelines, and moves beyond ownership to measure control and benefits of assets, in line with SDG Target 5.8 on equal rights to economic resources. Over the past decade, UNSD and its partners have made significant strides in advancing the measurement of complex dimensions of well-being, including through the development and promotion of international standards, guidance, and tools for time use statistics. These include the International Classification for Time Use Statistics, or ICATUS 2016, the revised UN Guide to Producing Statistics on Time Use, and the Minimum Harmonized Instrument, which supports countries in producing more frequent and cost-efficient time use statistics. These frameworks have helped countries produce more coherent, comparable, and policy-relevant time use data, supporting a fuller understanding of well-being and the distribution of paid and unpaid work. MAGNET also builds on the strides we have made to measure time use, now looking at time agency, the flexibility and control women have over their own schedules. The ultimate goal of producing high-quality gender data is to create a virtuous cycle where robust evidence informs transformative legislation and policies, which in turn generates further demand and funding for statistics. The reflections we will hear today from Malawi government counterparts are a testament to this institutionalization of gender statistics within national statistical frameworks, and I want to congratulate them for the methodological innovation rooted in sound statistical principles. Thank you for your participation and for your continued dedication to making every woman and girl counted and visible. Thank you, Irene. Back to you.
Thank you, Maria Isabel. Truly interesting and important work. Let me now turn to the focus of today's webinar. So, measuring women's agency, validated tools from the MAGNET Initiative for Integration into Household Surveys. So the MAGNET Initiative is a collaboration between the World Bank's Africa Gender Innovation Lab and Living Standards Measurement Study teams, the International Food Policy Research Institute, the International Rescue Committee, and researchers at Oxford University, Makerere University, the Asian Development Bank, the Brookings Institution, Tufts University, and the University of Alicante. So presenting today, we have, and I'm gonna present them in order of appearance. So we have Cheryl Doss, who is a professor of economics at Tufts University. So Cheryl's research spans rural transformation, gender in agriculture, household decision-making, and women's ownership of assets, with a particular focus on methodological innovations in survey designs that capture multiple and competing voices within households. Prior to joining Tufts, she was on faculty at Oxford and Yale universities and has worked extensively with international organizations, including the World Bank, FAO, UNDP, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among others. Athelia Donald is a senior economist and thematic leader at the Africa Gender Innovation Lab of the World Bank. Her research focuses on gender and economic activity, spanning marriage, mechanization, childcare, financial inclusion, women's land rights, and intra-household cooperation, as well as methodological work on survey data collection. Before joining the World Bank, she was a research fellow at Harvard University's Evidence for Policy Design. Then we will hear from Heather Moylan, who is a senior economist at the Living Standards Measurement Study Team of the World Bank. Her research interests span gender, poverty, agriculture, and data collection methods. As a member of the LSMS team, she brings deep expertise in the design, implementation, quality control, and analysis of household surveys. Following this presentation, we will have Shelton Kanyanda, who is the Commissioner of Statistics in Malawi, overseeing the production and dissemination of all official statistics. He has led several pioneering initiatives, including the Women's Empowerment Metric for National Statistical Systems, high-frequency phone surveys, and the use of mobile network provider data for statistical purposes. He has also served as a senior economist with the World Bank's LSMS team and as a regional program coordinator at Paris 21. With that, I am pleased to hand the floor to our presenters. Thank you all for joining us today. And Cheryl, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. So we're going to talk about a number of the tools that Magnet has put together. Magnet has actually developed 24 tools looking at agency. Next slide. Sorry, I've just gotten lost in my, there we go, sorry. So Magnet has two overarching goals as to what we're trying to do. The first one is to really broaden the measurement of agency, thinking about what are we measuring when we're trying to measure agency. So the tools have more emphasis on areas like goal setting, control over time, so not just measuring time, but measuring control over time, and thinking about people's preferences. What do they actually want? So that's one set of kind of goals. The other set of goals is to really deepen our measurement of agency, particularly the measurement piece of it, and trying to identify some of the best practices in survey design and survey implementation around things like enumerator choice or question order, response options, and then also this kind of unpacking what we mean by jointness. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So far, we have, as I said, we have 24 goals. We have 24 tools. We have implemented these in 75 different surveys. So each tool has been in an average of 3. Some have been in more surveys than that as a means to really validate the tools. They have been put in place in 19 countries, spanning Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Central and Western Asia, and South Asia, so across the globe. And we now have this batch of validated tools that are ready. They're ready for adoption and integration into large-scale household surveys. So what do we mean when we talk about agency? We're trying to measure agency. What is it that we're trying to measure? And we're looking at a definition of agency that is the ability to set goals and to act on them. So that means that first people have to be able to define their goals, the goals that are in line with their own values. They need then to be able to act on those goals, to be able to achieve them. And then they also need to believe in those. They need to believe and understand that they have a sense of control and ability to set their goals and act on them. So we think about these types of agency in 3 focus areas. One is about preferences and internalized norms. So really thinking about what is it that people want? What do they value? both what they consciously want and value, but also what they unconsciously associate together. So what are those preferences and internalized norms that people have that affect their agency? Then second, we think about the decision making. Who's actually making the decisions? What control do they have over, as she was talking earlier about assets, not just thinking about ownership, but what is the control over them, particularly thinking about assets and other resources. And then thirdly, some of the tools focus on the sense of agency, people's self-efficacy, their time agency, and their perceived control. So those are the three kind of broad areas that we're looking at. So I'm going to talk about two tools. The first tool is the enumerator effects. So one of the things that I'm sure we all know or think about if we're implementing surveys is who's asking the question may influence the answers. And we often think about this in our gender work, about thinking about whether or not we need to match up the gender of the enumerator and the respondent in order to get good answers, get appropriate answers. But one of the tools is really looking at whether we need to think about more than just the gender piece of it. So we can think about two different things. One is the personal characteristics of the enumerator. So their sex, gender, age, place of birth, their education, marital status, whether they have children, whether their spouse works, whether they have assets themselves, right? So those are all things that we might think really might matter for how the enumerator might affect how the respondent is going to answer. But there's another piece that we've been worrying about when we're thinking about asking these questions about gender. And some of this comes out of enumerator trainings that we've done, where when you start training the enumerators, they start telling you the answers, right? What they know about what they believe is right and what they think is happening in the community. So we wondered what is the extent to which the enumerators' beliefs, particularly their deeply held beliefs about gender, might affect the respondents' answers. And so we focus this tool specifically thinking about asset ownership. So how does the enumerators' attitudes about whether or not women should own assets going to affect the responses that they get from both men and women? So we ask them, prior to any of the training, enumerator training, we ask them about their own beliefs. Questions such as whether men's opinion should matter more when households are selling jointly owned land, or whether it should matter more on inheritance of jointly owned land, or women do not need to consult husbands to sell the land they own alone, or on separation, women should get half of the jointly owned assets. So we asked them again, before they had any training, what their own beliefs were. Some of the same kinds of questions we often ask respondents in these kinds of surveys. So we're going to look at two different things. One is just a simple measure of how much enumerator fixed effects affect the responses to questions. So that's what this slide is showing us. So this is data from Malawi, and looking at how much enumerator effects affect the respondents' answer to questions about, on the left-hand side, we have age, whether they're married, whether they've ever been in school, the household size, how much they work, and their income. And we see a very small impact of some kind of enumerator fixed effects on those kinds of questions. But on the right-hand side, we see a much greater impact of enumerator fixed effects on questions about how many plots the respondent owns, whether they have the right to sell it, whether they have the right to inherit it, and who makes the decisions about crops. So this just tells us that there are enumerator fixed effects, and that they're bigger for some of these more subjective kinds of measures than they are for the kinds of things that are a bit more objective, like whether the respondent has ever been to school. So then we want to pull that apart a little bit And we want to look at, well, which characteristics seem to matter? So this is just part of a much bigger regression analysis, but it shows you the characteristics of the respondent. We almost always ask respondent characteristics to go along with whether men have. So the questions that were being asked to the respondents were whether the men have rights to use the land, sell it, to inherit it, and then whether the women have those same rights. And so the respondent's age certainly affects all of that. We would expect that the respondent's age affects whether they do have those kinds of rights. But then we also look at enumerator characteristics, their gender, their age, and whether or not they're married. And none of those have any effect on the responses that we get from the participants. But the enumerator's subjective views, the final row there, all has a large and statistically significant impact on whether or not the men or women say they have the rights over these kinds of assets. So the enumerator's subjective views about whether it's appropriate for women to own assets does influence the answers that they get from both men and women when conducting a survey asking about these kinds of questions, which says we need to be thinking much more about about the enumerators, right? So these questions were asked, the enumerators' opinions or their own views were asked before they were trained, even though they were then later trained about how to ask the questions, what to do, how they should be thinking about it. Their prior views still influence the kinds of results that they got. So this has implications more broadly for how we think about conducting the surveys and how we need to be thinking about the impacts of enumerators, particularly on these sensitive kinds of questions, such as those about gender. The second tool that I'm gonna talk about is the other kind of broad question one of the questions we were interested in, that I'm particularly interested in, is this question. There's lots of work thinking about individual ownership or joint ownership, right? And now a lot of surveys have started to ask whether the assets, particularly land, but other assets, are owned individually or jointly. And there's certainly a big strand of the literature that really assumes that every woman wants a field of her own, that women are better off if they own assets themselves individually. But a lot of qualitative work that I've been involved with and many of us on the team have been involved with suggests that maybe that's not always the case, and that there at least are times when women talk about really wanting to own assets jointly with their husband. So we thought we would try to see if we could develop a tool that would help us understand what they think is better. So we have a very simple version of the tool that could be implemented in any kind of a large scale survey that just says we've got two people. I'm going to call them A and B. We give them culturally appropriate names when we actually do this. And in scenario 1, A and B together own a 2-acre plot of land. And in scenario 2, it's split. Each one owns 1 acre individually. And so the question that we ask then is, which scenario is more desirable for the wife, right? And on the right, I have the responses from 4 different surveys where we've implemented this question. And so I'm showing you the percentage where people say that joint ownership is more desirable for the wife than an even split. And then I've got it divided by whether the respondent was a man or a woman. Each of these are different samples. Most of the samples are not nationally representative. So I wouldn't take this as being what people, everywhere in Tanzania or Cote d'Ivoire certainly think, but just to give you a sense that the patterns really differ across countries, but that we see that a substantial number of people, both men and women, think that joint ownership is more desirable for the wife than having the wife own her own plot of land that's half the size, right? Let me just say the Cote d'Ivoire sample is of urban factory workers, so it's a quite different sample. But we see quite a bit of variation. We also did next slide. We also did in 2 countries, I'll show you Kenya, a much more nuanced version of it, where we started out and said, which do you think is better, more desirable for the wife? A scenario where she owns 1/4 of an acre of land and her husband owns 1 3/4 acre, or where they own 2 acres jointly. And so what this shows us is the percentage of respondents who say that a woman is at least as well off under joint ownership of 2 acres of land as that amount of individually owned land. So we've got that 20% of about 20% of both men and women say that a woman is equally as well off owning 1/4 of acre of land herself as owning 2 acres jointly with her husband. So some people are arguing, saying that women are always better off with some property, some land of their own. We also see on the other extreme that about 60% of people say that she's as well off owning 2 acres of land alone as compared to 2 acres of land jointly, which also means that about 40% of people responded that she's better off owning 2 acres of land jointly than 2 acres of land individually. The joint is always better than individual ownership. Next slide. So that's a really quick overview of these tools. Let me tell you the takeaways from this questions about preferences over ownership. One is that joint ownership is widely seen as being beneficial for women. When given the choice of having women own something individually versus jointly, we often see both men and women responding that the woman would be better off owning it jointly. The patterns differ pretty widely across countries, but we see throughout that there's always some who think that women are better off owning individually, and there are some who think that women are always better off owning jointly. So it means we really can't make an assumption about whether women think that it's better to own land or other assets individually or to own them jointly. We ought to be trying to find out before we put in place projects and programs that are allocating assets to really figure out in the local context which is seen as being better for women. And this really simple version of the tool, we're just asking about half of all of it or all of half, right? Do you get 1 acre on your own or 2 acres jointly, could be very easily implemented in large scale surveys. And so we can gather that information and be able to understand under which contexts and in which kinds of programs should we be thinking about joint ownership versus individual ownership.
Okay, I will now come in with 2 more tools from the project. So first I'll continue on this assets journey, and I'll take us through our decision-making over assets tool. And then we'll shift gears a little bit, and we'll talk more about a sense of agency, particularly around time use and flexibility. So starting with decision-making over assets. So I don't think within this group we need to motivate too much the importance of assets, and Maria Isabel and Cheryl already highlighted this in some of their remarks. But we know that asset ownership is important for access to credit, boost productivity and income, provide security amid shocks. But unfortunately, we also know that it's very difficult to measure asset ownership. And so there's many different components in multiple dimensions and involved. And it's not just, whether someone has an asset, but we also care about who can actually use it, who controls decisions, and who benefits from it. We also know that collecting full asset data can be quite costly. And so that also builds on the UN Edge project that Maria Isabel mentioned in her opening remarks. And so it's something that those of us
presenting today, and many of you on the call as well, who've been working on for many years, kind of identifying the challenges in measuring asset ownership, as well as, who is the right person to ask this question to, right? So we want to ideally collect this information from multiple individuals within the household, but we also see that most of the time, household surveys default simply to asking this information at the household level. So with Magnet, our idea was, motivating this work, how can we really better capture all of these many different dimensions in a way that is actually feasible for scaling up as part of large-scale surveys? So next, thank you, Alethea. So to address this, we developed what we call the asset control and benefits scale. And so here the idea is we've simplified the process of collecting information on asset ownership, and we've also kind of gone beyond what traditional ownership questions miss, right? So typically in a household survey, we're going to see questions on reported ownership, potentially documented ownership, right, if we're thinking also about measuring SDGs. But here we wanted to go beyond this. And so here we actually capture 16 core dimensions of control over and benefits from assets. And you'll see over here on the right-hand side, you'll see a few of these examples, right? So for control over assets, we're looking at I have an asset that I can use whenever I want, however I want. When we think about the benefit side, because I have the asset, I feel more protected in the face of shocks. Or I can have the asset, I can use this to earn more income. And so we tested this in both India and Uganda, which were two of our Magnet surveys. And you'll see that we tested a whole array of asset classes. So land, dwelling, livestock, mobile phones, large appliances, and transportation. And we do see pretty high correlation between the control and benefit dimensions across most asset classes. But so now let's move into the results from India. Perfect. So here we see that men generally report stronger rights and benefits across most dimensions. But here the gender gaps, they're actually more moderate than what we'll look at on the next slide for Uganda. But there are some dimensions, particularly around basic use rights, where women report relatively similar levels of having this right. But we do see larger gaps emerging for dimensions that we think of as stronger forms of control and decision-making authority. So we can already kind of see why a simple ownership question misses some important aspects of asset ownership. So then let's move to Uganda. So in Uganda, so here we really see, right, so we have women, similar to India, so we have women in red, men in blue, and here we see much larger gaps across the board, right? And so, but we do see kind of some similarities across both India and Uganda. So two dimensions kind of stand out to us in both countries. And so the first is decision-making over economic benefits. And the second is what happens to the asset mostly depends on the respondent. So this is where we see some of the widest gender gaps. And this, again, this is quite closely tied to what we think of as empowerment and economic agency. So again, if we just kind of had a simple question about ownership, we would be missing a really important storyline. And then lastly, we'll just look a bit here at what we're calling kind of common bundles of rights. So what is the distribution of some of the positive statements? And here we're focusing, again, on land in India. And so we see that in India, men's responses are heavily skewed towards the highest number of positive response statements, while women's responses, you can see, are a bit more spread out, a bit more dispersed. And for women, lower agreement is especially concentrated around statements that are related to decision-making power and economic benefit distribution. So here, kind of the broader takeaway is just that ownership itself is not, it doesn't capture enough if we want to consider agency. And so just to quickly kind of summarize, and one thing I'll note here as well as, so this version of the tool, we mentioned it has 16 statements about rights, control, and benefits, but we also recognize that even this is a bit large for a large-scale survey, so we're also working on developing a shorter version of this tool. But it really does highlight to us that men persistently report greater control over assets. We see smaller gender gaps for the general control statements, and larger gender gaps for more empowered forms of control. And we do see some variation across asset classes. Of course, here we only had time to get into land, but we'll share full results as well. And so what does this mean? It's really important that when designing a survey that you're capturing information on asset ownership. A single ownership question just simply isn't enough. And so we encourage using these kind of multi-item scales that distinguish these different dimensions of asset ownership. Okay. So now I'm going to change gears quite a bit. So we'll move to one of the other themes of Magnet. So here we'll focus on sense of agency, and in this case specifically time agency, which also Marie-Isabelle and Cheryl were also kind of touching on in their earlier remarks as well. So when we think about agency, so a major challenge that we're facing is that many of the existing measures that we started to work with when Magnet kicked off was that these different measures of agency were originally developed in higher income settings, and that doesn't necessarily always translate well to lower income or rural contexts. So part of the work involved adapting existing scales, but also developing entirely new measures for the dimensions of agency that historically have not been measured very well. And so one example here is flexibility over time use. And so the starting point for this, kind of a familiar fact, we all know this, women spend substantially more time on unpaid care and domestic work than men. But one of the key insights from this research is that time poverty is not the same as time agency. So traditional time use surveys that we're likely all familiar with, they tell us how much time people spend on different activities, but they don't necessarily tell us anything about, do people actually have control or choice or flexibility over how they allocate their time to these activities. So we wanted to ask, to what extent can women and men actually reallocate their time, and what dimensions are we missing if we only use our typical traditional time use diaries or measures? So what we find, so here, kind of this headline finding, and maybe not surprising, but women are less likely than men to report flexibility in their activities. So beyond simply spending more time on unpaid work, women also appear to face tighter constraints on how they can adjust and allocate their time. And this highlights an important dimension of agency that we just simply can't capture as part of our standard time use modules. So next slide. Oh, sorry, I've skipped one. Back one. Thanks, Alethea. And so finally, these measures appear closely linked also to employment outcomes. So women with lower flexibility are more likely to be unpaid contributing family workers. They're also less likely to report wanting additional work hours or actively looking for work. So flexibility over time use, it does appear to be strongly correlated to economic opportunity and labor force participation. And so that suggests that these types of measures may provide insights that our traditional time use modules simply would miss. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Alethea. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Heather. So I will take you through 2.5 more tools. So this is really kind of like an overview, a buffet platter of like little sampling of results from the Magnet initiative, and then we can get into more details in the discussion and look forward to your questions. And I'll mention at the end, but we have all of these tools also available online. But the first tool that I will talk about is our generalized livelihood self-efficacy scale. So self-efficacy is the belief in your own ability to act effectively towards a goal. And it's a classic psychological agency construct, but existing scales were developed in higher income setting, mostly for educational or formal workplace contexts. So we designed and validated this one specifically to cover livelihoods and lower income settings that would be applicable across a broad range of income earning activities. So before the Magnet initiative, there were scales, that did capture self-efficacy over work, but they were very specific to the, certain type of workplaces, mostly formal workplaces, and were not applicable to all kinds of income earning activities. So this was tested in 3 pilots, 2 in Kenya and 1 in Tanzania, and recently Malawi fielded it in their latest panel survey as well. The scale covers three main things. So whether people can decide how to spend their time and household resources on economic activities, items 1 through 5, whether they have the skills, networks, and financial support they need, items 6 through 9, and then whether they have the confidence to succeed. So a first finding is that women score significantly lower than men in both samples we ran with both men and women. So here the livelihoods efficacy scale is in green, and you can contrast this with other psychological construct scales we developed and fielded under Magnet that actually Shelton will be speaking about a bit later. So in the Kenya KYEOP survey, that's the end line of the Kenya Youth Employment and Opportunities Project, a government of Kenya program with World Bank financing, around 9,000 young people aged 18 to 37. The gap is around 0.15 standard deviations. In the nationally representative Tanzania LSMS survey, the gender gap is much larger, around 0.5 standard deviations. And noticeably, generalized self-efficacy over livelihoods is the only construct where women score lower everywhere we tested it and where the gender gap reaches such a large magnitude. In terms of the measurement properties, the internal reliability of the tool is good, and at least 70% of respondents rate the item as fully clear and simple to answer. Our factor analysis supports a two-factor structure, so people really think of control and decisions on one side and resources and skills on the other. Though where this tool really earns its place in a household survey is in terms of its predictive power. So 1 standard deviation increase in self-efficacy predicts a 5 to 9 percentage point higher probability of working. And that's across 3 samples, the Kenya IDRC, which is a baseline of about 1,600 young women entering a vocational training program, the Kenya KYEOP that I mentioned, and the Tanzania LSMS survey. So it predicts 2 to 4 additional hours of work per week and 10 to 13 additional dollars in weekly earnings. Among youth in Kenya, it predicts a 9 percentage point higher probability of business ownership for women, 11 for men, with positive effects on profits. It also predicts well-being and empowerment. Life satisfaction goes up by about 0.15 standard deviation per 1 standard deviation increase in self-efficacy. And in Tanzania, food insecurity drops by 0.17 standard deviations. Intra-household decision-making increases by more than 0.2 standard deviations, and the effect on women's decision-making is twice as large as on men's. So in the Kenya KYEOP sample where we have IPV data, a 1 standard deviation increase is associated with a 3 percentage point lower probability of lifetime intimate partner violence, emotional and physical. So the scale is really valuable both in terms of capturing gender differences and in terms of being meaningfully correlated with development outcomes that we care about. So switching back now to preferences and internalized norms, here I'll briefly mention our affect misattribution procedure tool just to throw something a little different in the mix than more traditional survey questions. So we know that different survey questions on gender attitudes and norms are vulnerable to social desirability bias. So respondents often tell us what they think we want to hear, and separately, they may not be consciously aware of their own associations. The affect misattribution procedure, AMP, captures automatic associations that may not surface in stated beliefs, and the indirect format reduces social desirability incentives. So for those that are familiar, it's similar to the implicit association test used in psychology, but simpler to use for field deployments. And the version we developed under Magnet is specifically to capture implicit attitudes regarding which occupations it is appropriate for women and men to work in, since we know that occupational segregation is one of the largest drivers of the gender gap worldwide and can create large labor market inefficiencies. So we tested this in representative-ish samples in India and Uganda. So here's an example of how it works. The respondent sees an occupational prime, something like male lawyer or female lawyer. Then a Chinese character, which in this literature is the most common neutral picture used in this test. And they rate whether the Chinese character is more or less pleasant than average. Respondents aren't familiar with Chinese, where you deploy this. If you are deploying it in a sample familiar with Chinese, obviously you'd use a different neutral image. But the test works because respondents tend to misattribute their effective reaction from the prime onto the character itself. So if seeing female lawyer produces some discomfort, that comes through as rating the character less pleasant. And we compare two types of primes. So congruent ones match the gender traditionally associated with the occupation. So for example, male lawyer, female nurse, while incongruent ones flip it. The bias score is the average difference in ratings, incongruent minus congruent. So a negative score means a congruent primes feel more pleasant. That's the bias we're trying to capture. So there are lots of interesting results coming out of this tool, including bias being correlated with the respondent's own occupational choice. But in the interest of time, I'll just show you two quick descriptive patterns. So these are the results for Uganda, where we compute the degree of bias for the 33 professions in our data set and plot the 8 with the largest negative and positive effects on this graph. So we can see the largest negative effects are for female roofers and male taxi drivers, followed by male babysitters. Only 2 professions have positive effects, which would be female grounds maintenance workers and female mobile money agents, but the effect sizes are very small. And I think it's interesting that the 2 professions with the largest effects are traditionally male. So women being roofers, women being taxi drivers, again, followed by male babysitters. In India, this is a little different. So the top 3 negative occupations are all traditionally female professions. So we have house husbands followed by male housekeepers, and then again, we do find the male babysitter. So this is just to show you the type of data that this tool, which just takes a few minutes to implement because the reaction times are so short, can produce. And respondents said the tool was a nice break from the monotony of more standard interview questions, and it was administered by enumerators on a tablet with no specialized training. So the last two, very briefly, is about using artificial intelligence, AI, to compute agency scores to automatically transcribe recordings of respondent answers to open-ended questions. So we know that qualitative interviews about decision-making yield the richest understanding of agency we can have, but they're expensive to collect and analyze. And we wanted to see whether AI could help close that gap. So for this tool, 2 qualitative sociologists, qualitative experts in Uganda hand-coded 200 women's respondents to establish ground truth. And we then ran 6 unsupervised machine learning approaches against the hand-coded scores to see which features worked best. So we're about to rerun it with the most frontier AI models, but so far, and I found this quite interesting, one of the approaches that worked best is one of the simplest, which is the frequency of the word I as a subject in the transcript. But stay tuned for more results on this tool. So with that, that's it for the first part of the presentation. Thanks for bearing with us for this quick overview and kind of sampler platter of all the different magnet tools. And next, you'll hear from Shelton on the magnet tools tested in Malawi and his reflections on the experience.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
For now, we see your Teams app. You need to switch over to the PowerPoint.
Okay, I thought I'm in the PowerPoint. There, are you? Is that PowerPoint?
No, not yet. Maybe try to unshare and then reshare again.
Okay. Let me stop sharing. Apologies for that. Okay. How about that?
No, we still see your browser window.
We see the team screen with all of us on it.
Is it? Strange. Strange. Okay. Okay. In that case, let me speak even without sharing.
We've got it now.
We've got it now,
Is
but
it?
just click full screen
Okay.
at the bottom. Yes, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Let me present a little bit from the Malawi's perspective, measuring agency in Malawi. These are validated psychometric scales and time use agency tools from the pilot magnet that Malawi did and also other sub-Saharan countries. So basically, two tools were tested in Malawi. So the first one being the psychometric agency scale, and the second one is the time use agency module. So under the first two, we had the three scales, the goal setting capacity, which I think my colleague also presented, the agriculture self-efficacy, and also short form of locus of control. While on the time use agency, we also looked at whether the respondent could have chosen not to do an activity, whether the respondent could have changed when an activity was done, and also asked for two most satisfying and two least satisfying activities. So in terms of 2-1, the three scale measures, the first one was to goal setting capacity. The second one was the agriculture self-efficacy, and the third one being the locus of control. So under Go1, what we noted is that it will capture the capacity to define clear, actionable goals and believe in their importance. New short-form instruments are designed for use outside formal employment settings. The domain-specific confidence in completing the 4 phases of an agriculture activity, searching, planning, marshalling, implementing, first scale of its kind for small holder agriculture. While on the third locus of control, where the outcomes are seen as driven by own actions, by chance, or by powerful others. Disentangled household members from community members as powerful others. How this performed in Malawi, the psychometric summary. In terms of goal setting, what we noted is that in terms of structural validity and in internal reliability, the goal setting were both strong, while the agriculture self-efficacy was strong, but very strong in terms of internal reliability, while the locus control was strong, but weak in terms of internal reliability. So what we noted is that the locus of control showed weak internal reliability across countries, a known issue when items split into opposing internal, external subscale, structure validity remains strong. Malawi adaptations from cognitive interviewing, most respondents interpreted well-being as physical health rather than broader life success. So we ended up replacing the success, replaced with success. There's also a rephrase, personal interest to myself and my livelihood and what is important for me. And that's what most people thought that personal interests were. Also, area general lessons replaced enjoyable with satisfied in time use agency module after cognitive testing in Zomba in one of the surveys. And what the scales revealed about agency and outcomes, pulled survey-specific regressions, link each construct to economic and well-being outcomes. The Malawi findings highlight where agency matters most. The locus of control gave us a negative 0.18 standard deviation. And what we noted that in terms of food insecurity, a 1 standard deviation increase in internal locus of control is associated with a 0.18 standard deviation reduction in food insecurity in Malawi, the strongest food security association across 3 scales fielded. In terms of agriculture self-efficacy, among women in Malawi, a 1 standard deviation increase in agricultural self-efficacy is linked to 2.1 additional hours of paid work per week. Effect is strongest for women. While in terms of decision-making effect, a close survey including Malawi agency decision-making associations are at least twice as large for married women as for married men, suggesting agency matters more for women's intra-household position. But looking at the second two as well, in terms of flexibility, captures something distinct from time burdens. Women, in terms of job searching, greater non-flexibility predicts lower likelihood of looking for work in the last week. Total unpaid or paid hours have no separate effects. In terms of women underemployment, less flexibility is linked to lower probability of wanting more paid hours if employed. Effect concentrated in non-flexibility of unpaid work. In terms of contributing family work, higher non-flexibility raises the probability of being an unpaid contributing family worker, a lower earning role. And in terms of men, sleep and leisure, non-flexibility in agriculture or non-farm employment reduces share of daily time in sleep and leisure. For women, the effect is limited to leisure. Households, intra-households, men versus women. Households where women's non-flexibility share exceeds men's by 25 percentage points show poor women's outcomes, lower leisure, higher underweight prevalence, and weak land rights. And distinct from time burdens across outcomes, non-flexibility and total time in unpaid paid work have separately significant effects. They capture different dimensions of inequality. In terms of experiencing these two in Malawi, what we could, as NSO, take home. We noted that although the questionnaire was initially perceived as long, but in terms of administration, when we were administering the survey, the actual time that the questionnaire could last was improving quite a lot. And the use of pictures on smartphones made it easier for enumerators to explain the questions to respondents. We also noted that respondents accepted the modules as the use of BELT was well presented and demonstrated during the sensitization campaign. The research assistants clearly explained the gadgets to respondents. In terms of translation and cognitive testing experience, the questionnaires were well translated to ensure uniformity among enumerators. However, During the early days of the interviews, some enumerators struggled to explain questions that were cognitive in nature. The recommendation is that there's need to intensify training in cognitive interviewing skills for training officers in NSOs and other research institutions. Logistics around the smartphone time diary. The presentation of the survey smartphones logistics was well done, taking advantage of community leaders who later briefed the people also increased the trust. Also, male-to-male interview and female-to-female approach increased the trust and cooperation between enumerators and respondents. Overall, the logistics were well managed. But also in terms of comparability with existing instruments, to gain household trust, NSO tools go through similar procedures, including translation, piloting, and introducing the survey to the community leaders before proceeding to the households. We have also noted that the tools contain similar questions with minor differences. The smartphone-based tool was a more magnet, and use of smartphones innovation needs to be harnessed across the national statistical systems. What worked well? What was challenging? What worked well? The sensitization campaign on the use of smartphones and the belt was important, as these are new surveys in Malawi. Households showed willingness to participate. But in terms of challenges, the phones sometimes were misused for show off, other than for the original plans. Only Chichewa used, need other languages beyond the Chichewa, which was used for translation. We also noted that there were some network issues at early data checks, and also the lead belts that were given used with the phones linked to some myths, including Satanism. There are also more female than male attendants at most of the meetings. In terms of integrating into upcoming surveys, the surveys provides a good foundation for mainstreaming digital time use modules into NSO surveys instruments, but also in the RSMS IHS, which already includes a time use module where the traditional recall method is used. NSO can consider other surveys such as the Labor Force Survey, the National Survey on Agriculture. NSO is also planning to include the WEMS instrument into the annual surveys of agriculture in 2026. Disaggregation plans, region, urban, rural, gender. Most survey results at NSO are disseminated with key indicators disaggregated by region, place of residence, and gender. Following this established practice, it is important that time use indicators are also disaggregated along the same dimensions for policy relevance. Analytical priorities for Malawi data. The Malawi smartphone time use experiment has provided data that can be used by various MDAs, Ministries Department, and SGSs in Malawi, especially the Ministry of Gender. These may include indicators on gender differences in unpaid care and domestic work, labor supply and productivity, or in all, it can be used for methodological benchmarking. In terms of dissemination and policy uptake, to maximize policy relevance, dissemination should be beyond technical reporting. NSO, in collaboration with the National Planning Commission, has recently been producing policy briefs for policymakers from reports such as the Child Multi-Poverty Index and conducting district-specific dissemination of the results. We can follow up the same tradition and practice to maximize the use of these results. I think we can also link with some of the labor, agriculture, and welfare statistics, such as the Labor Force Survey, the annual surveys on agriculture, and the IHS RSMS survey that we conduct. I think that's the Malawi perspective that I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shelton. And thank you to all the presenters, Maria Isabel, Cheryl, Asilia, Heather, and Shelton, for this insightful presentation. We're moving now to the Q&A session. We have received a couple of questions in the chat and in the Q&A box, but I encourage you to don't be shy and raise your hand and ask questions to our presenters directly. So in the meantime, I can, I see that Alicia has already given an answer, but I don't know if she wants to reply to the whole floor and, let me read the question that was posed to you. So from Amalia, so what was the reliability for the self-efficacy scale? And did you also measure social norms as gender?
Great. I can go ahead. I didn't know whether to take that and the Q&A one at the same time.
Yeah.
But the internal reliability of the generalized livelihood self-efficacy scale was strong. I can also put that paper in the chat now, where you see an overview of basically all our main psychological scales put together. So our generalized livelihood scale that I presented, the goal setting scale, the agricultural self-efficacy scale, and the locus of control scale that Shelton presented as well. But in overall, the generalized self-efficacy scale, it had strong reliability and then one of the strongest predictive validity for outcomes. Social norms read gender in this paper, no. We have some attitudes measures, but not overall social norms for this paper. Although maybe I'll go ahead, since I have the floor anyway, and talk about the other question in the Q&A where we do have social norms data. I wasn't sure if the social norms question was for the livelihood scale or that one. But for the effect misattribution procedure, the internalized attitudes regarding occupational acceptability of women and men in different professions, we see some interesting patterns actually related to social norms, where in India, where, as we know, women's labor force participation is a lot lower than in Uganda, we see a stronger link. So in villages where norms around women working are more progressive, we see the bias reducing. And so the kind of internalized bias tracks these village norms and acceptability, whereas in Uganda, where there's a much smaller gender gap in women's labor force participation, we don't really see the internalized bias tracking norms, but there it seems to track more, it seems to be more related to explicit individual attitudes or more idiosyncratic beliefs. So there's an interesting kind of relationship between these internalized beliefs and attitudes and norms that vary really depending on the acceptability of the behavior in question in particular settings. And so then regarding the AI images, so the working paper will be out soon where we'll specify the prompts, but part of what we wanted is to really see whether a method that was easily scalable and generalizable would work well. So we did do, a review of the AI images generated. In the prompt, we tried to, say, to kind of standardize features across men and women. So what would be different would be their gender. But our approach was then to field it and say, okay, on average, is this able to pick up the bias? And it seems to have, a very strong signal, both in terms of explicitly what the respondents are saying about them understanding it and enjoying the tool, but then also the patterns we're seeing in the data regarding the different levels of bias by professions and correlation with other outcomes that we care about. Thanks.
Thank you, Alicia. We have now a question from the floor from Megumi Rosenberg. You can ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Megumi Rosenberg. I work at the World Health Organization, and I work on measuring the extent to which people experience financial hardship due to out-of-pocket payments for health care. And in our team, we are considering looking at possibly the differential risk faced by female-headed households. And we have we've been discussing a paper that talks about typologies of female-headed households. And the paper identifies specifically female-headed households with children and no other adults. So basically single mother households, as well as single women with no other household members, so women living alone, as being the two types that are most commonly seen and also often at most risk of poverty. And so my question to the speakers is, are you aware of any research that has compared or examined the level of agency among female heads of household, and specifically, female heads of single mothers and single women living alone compared to other, compared to women living in other family contexts? Because when it comes to agencies, I'm wondering if they heads of household, women who are heads of household might have greater agency, yet these other papers are saying they're, at greater risk of poverty and such. So I'm just wondering if you're aware of any relevant research and if you have any insights into this. Thank you.
I don't know if I should kick us off and then pass to others. So I'm thinking of some papers. I need to do a deeper search, and then we'll share those with you. But canonically, what we see with female-headed households is that they score higher on some measures and lower on others, right? So in terms of like, are you able to make decisions on your own? That kind of measure of agency tends to be higher among female-headed households because they are the head of the household, right? They don't have to negotiate with a partner and so on and so forth. But then perhaps when it comes to the number of assets they can make decisions over, or whether they feel like they have the skills and the time and so on to succeed, some of those measures can be lower. Again, it depends a bit on the context. But I think it's really looking within the dimensions and classifying, okay, if you think of, a woman, if the main comparator is a woman in a household with another man, what dimensions of agency would be lower? And it's typically that, it's lower autonomy. She's not the main one in charge. But at the same time, kind of the pool of resources she could draw on are lower. There's less risk diversification, as you pointed out, just because all the plots are hers, the assets are hers. There's less, let's invest more, or let's focus on the set of plots versus this. So there's less kind of intra-household risk sharing and diversification, exactly what you were saying. I think it's interesting to think, okay, what does that mean for program design, and how do we best take that into account, right? If we think, okay, covariate shock risk higher, idiosyncratic risk shocks, perhaps depending on context at the same level, but then like decision-making autonomy would be higher, right? And so what does that tell us about program design? There are some papers related to this that I will make sure I have the correct sites and then share with you. But I don't know if Cheryl and Heather or others, you have anything more to add on that.
So I don't know if we actually wrote this up or not, but I remember a project I was working on some years ago where we were looking at female-headed households and a bunch of other outcome kinds of variables. And one of the things that we found that really seemed to matter was how they became a female-headed household, right? And whether they became a female-headed household by expressing agency or not. I don't know if we would have even said it in those words, but right, the women who left their husbands because their husbands beat them for various other kinds of things, where they made the choice to become a female-headed household, had very different kinds of answers about a whole lot of things related to agency than female-headed households in which the husband had just deserted them or had died, right? So it'd be really interesting in thinking about these kinds of questions about the extent to which being a female-headed household is a result of women expressing agency or is the result of things outside of their control, which doesn't quite answer your question, but just kind of food for thought in thinking about that question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have another question from the floor from Omar Ali Jib. So please ask your question. Omar, can you hear us? We cannot hear you. Your microphone is not working. Okay, so could you please write your question in the chat or in the Q&A box, and I'll read it out. So in the meantime, I can ask another question that was written in the chat by Lauren Pandolfelli. And she's asking, regarding the analysis of enumerator effects on respondents' subjective responses to asset ownership questions, what do you think is the mechanism through which enumerators' attitudes are influencing respondents, and what are the implications for enumerator training? So I would ask this to Cheryl. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer for the why and what the mechanism is. The tool hasn't let us really figure out why that is. Right, and whether it's because of the way they're asking the questions or the, and kind of any of the follow-ups or prompts that they're asking, I don't know. I think that's part of our ongoing work, is to try to figure out kind of what the mechanisms are and then what that means we could do within training. But for now, all we know is that their attitudes really are, which we're not surprised about, right? But we actually have evidence to show that their attitudes are affecting the kinds of responses that they get.
So do you maybe already have some practical implications for NSOs? So should, training or selection change?
I mean, the really simple one would be to figure out if enumerators going in have really strong biases about these kinds of issues that they're being asked, so that when you're hiring enumerators to ask questions about women's asset ownership, if you have people applying for the job who say, why are we asking this? Women don't own assets, or women shouldn't own assets, that may be something that's going to come out then in your results, right? That they're going to their attitudes are then going to bias the results. So thinking about how you're hiring would be one kind of implication.
Thank you. So I can ask the question from Omar Ali Jib. Can you also write your affiliation, please? So he's asking if some of the Magnet tools can be used outside of surveys in administrative data systems as a way to evaluate women agencies for financial inclusion projects, for example.
I think the short answer is yes, but I'd love to hear a bit more about how to evaluate, what kinds of evaluation is it female-led agencies? Is it, female applicants for financial inclusion projects, to kind of steer you towards what might work best? Since, as Cheryl mentioned at the start, we have 24 different tools. But if, yeah, you can reach out to us, tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking about. That would be useful, and we can figure out what would work best. But broadly speaking, a bunch of the tools are easy enough to implement that they could be streamlined and adapted into administrative data systems.
Thank you, Alicia. So if there aren't any other questions on the floor, I do have a question for Shelton. And my question, because our audience is made up a lot of national statistical offices, so I think it would be interesting for them to know, what was the hardest part of fielding these modules in Malawi, and what would you change?
I think one of the most challenging thing was also just to be able to find a male respondent and a female respondent. Most of the times you could find the female respondent, the man is not around. You come the other time, the male respondent, the female respondent is not around. So I think as we are developing the issue of mobile phones, lessens those cases where you would always want to meet a person individually, and maybe if we could also consider interviewing by phone only, and then you see what would be the effects without necessarily having to meet the respondent in person. Maybe that could be another way of mitigating the issues of trying to meet the respondents at the same time or during that period of interview. So that's maybe one of the things we could do, always consider, and as we are saying, integrating into most of our surveys going forward.
Thank you, Shelton. And so let me ask you like a more overarching question. And I think, you've touched upon it, but I think you can, make talk a little bit about it. So what was the main measurement gap that you think Magnet filled, that existing tools were not, were not good enough for? I don't know who wants to take this answer out of our presenters.
I mean, I can start and then
I
just open up. But the issue of now trying to make sure that a female interviewer interviews a female respondent, and male interviewer interviews a male respondent is something that is also I think bringing in that kind of approach within the statistical system. I think it has proved that most in terms of data quality, this already starts improving the quality of the data, and also just the reliability between I think even across the regions, people may be more comfortable to respond to a fellow female or a fellow man respondent. So that's another thing that could also be considered as I think this approach is bringing about. But let me also let Cherry and others come in.
So I could say a little bit about some of the tools that look at assets, because that's the piece that I've worked on most for a really long time. And I think one of the things that we know, there's right, what people say, what people mean when they talk about ownership really, really varies. And particularly when you start talking about joint ownership, what it means really varies. So we have lots of times seen when you kind of go back with qualitative work, and what women will say when they say well, first of all, you get different answers from husbands and wives, which suggests that either probably that they have really different understandings of what ownership means. So a number of the tools in the assets bundle of tools are really trying to unpack and figure out what people mean when they talk about ownership, what rights they think go along with it, and then trying to unpack a lot of these issues about what joint ownership means. Because when we just either assume that women want individual ownership or assume that we know what they mean when they're talking about joint ownership, we're missing a big part of the story. So not all of those may be tools you want to put in a big nationally representative survey, but they may be tools that you want to implement in smaller sample surveys to really get at the depth and understanding in a particular context. So it could be really useful for projects, or could be useful as kind of some of the work to be done before a national survey to make sure that the questions in a big national survey reflect the understandings that people on the ground have.
Great, and maybe for me, from a big picture perspective, I think a lot of what we were seeing is that the most commonly used measures related to agency in large household surveys were most commonly imperfect proxies. Basically, everyone was using either standard ownership questions, or everyone is using the same decision-making questions, which ask about participation in decision-making, but not necessarily like why you don't do or don't participate, or just how much input you have. And so there was really this gap between like people who are experts in agency who had a lot of critiques of standard measures and were saying, oh, but this thing is conceptually important, and this thing, and then this wide gap between what actually got put into large household surveys in practice because of what people knew, what was short and what was off the shelf. And so really what Magnet has tried to do, and I think been relatively successful at, is filling the gap between these and really allowing people to use off-the-shelf measures that are short and applicable in a broad range of settings, but that really capture the heart of what agency is in a conceptually rigorous way.
Thank you. So I see that we have answered all the questions, and so we're right on time. So let me thank you. Thanks so much, our presenters, Alicia, Cheryl, Heather, and Shelton. Thank you, Maria Isabel, for your contribution at the opening. And thank you, everybody who joined, who participated from all over the world. And we encourage you to visit our website for the recording and materials and share it with your colleagues if you think they might be interested. And thank you all, and I hope to see you all at our next event. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.